Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, or ACFE, after studying 2,402 cases that led to $3.4 billion in losses across 143 countries and territories, they have the profile of an internal fraudster and 8 behavioral red flags to look out for. Not to mention the number one weakness that allowed the fraud in the first place and the number one way employers found out about the fraud. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 389, the profile of an internal fraudster and 8 behavioral red flags to watch out for, according to the ACFE. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, every 2 years, they come out with a report based on cases, internal fraud cases or occupational fraud cases that they have studied across quite a few countries and territories, and they present this, I think it's over 100-page report. And what I really like about it is not only do you get the report, but you get a lot of infographics that you can download separately based on what it is you want to see. And so, for example, there is a infographic of profile of a fraudster. There's an infographic of behavioral red flags, which is what I'm using for today's podcast. But there are other infographics too, if you want to look at, for example, the effectiveness of providing fraud awareness training. That might be of importance to your leadership, maybe your IT team or InfoSec security team, whoever you have that's providing that cybersecurity awareness training. They also have a infographic on 30 years, because they've been providing this report for 30 years, what they've learned from 3 decades of occupational fraud research. So over 24,000 cases. So they started this back in 1996. And so 2026, it is 30 years. Now, they didn't used to do it the first report was 1996, and then the next one was not until 2002. And it looks like after that, they started doing it every 2 years. But some of these cases, some of the years, the cases were like lower. So 2002, there was 663. 2004, it was 508. So it has been increasing. And like I said, this year was 2,402. Now, in the show notes, I am going to put a link to the report to the nations, and it's going to be the page where you can either download the full report or you can scroll down to get a download or to be able to download the infographics. So, before I get started, I do want to talk about a case that wasn't in this case, but it is something that is a documentary and has been for a few years now. It first appeared on Netflix and then YouTube, and it's still on YouTube. And I'll put a link to it to that YouTube video in the show notes. It was on Amazon too for a while, just recently, either late last year or early this year. I didn't check to see if it was there now, but it's definitely on YouTube, and it's about an hour and 10 minutes. And it's about a finance director, I think that's what she was, Rita Crudwell, who for over 20 years embezzled money from the city of Dixon, town of Dixon, Illinois, I believe it was. That's where Ronald Reagan grew up. In any event, that happened, and she was eventually caught. And she did serve some years in prison until she was, I believe, pardoned by the president. And so she was caught. We'll talk about some of the details of her case or of her fraud as we go through this profile of an internal fraudster, the behavioral red flags, the weaknesses, and then the way that the employers found out. So I'll kind of use that as a real life example when I talk about what the ACFE found and document it in this latest report. Okay, so we're going to start with the profile of a fraudster, and they do have 6 different areas that they categorized these fraudsters to be in. And the first one was level of authority. And what they found is that most internal fraudsters were employees or managers. So that's one. 41% were employees, and then 41%, the same, were managers. So they kind of tied between, in the percentage of cases, 41% were employees and 41% were managers. So that was a tie. And then the next one was drastically lower. That was an owner or executive. But when an owner or executive perpetrated fraud, internal fraud, the median loss was way higher. So employees, the median loss was 50,000. Managers, the median loss was 125, and then owner or executive was 475,000. And then the next one was tenure. So the longer a fraudster has worked for a company or organization, the more costly their fraud. And so anyone that has been there, let's say more than 10 years, their median loss was 200,000. The next one was gender. So women actually committed fewer frauds and caused lower losses. So men committed the fraud in 71% of the cases, and the median loss was 125,000, where women committed fraud in only 28% of the cases, and they had a median loss of 90,000. Now, the next one is education. So, more than 60% of occupational fraudsters or internal fraudsters had a degree or higher. And then the next one is collusion. So, fraudsters who colluded with others caused median losses that were 4 times as high as those that acted alone. And it was something actually that they talked about in 10 years. They did a special one, I think it was in 2022. Maybe it was in 2024, but they did a special one, 10 years of looking back at at fraud, and they talked about how collusion was increasing. And so they did find that median loss was higher. And I guess that makes sense because you have more access to perpetrate fraud. And then the last one was age. So more than two-thirds of the fraudsters were between 31 and 50 years old. So, according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, or the ACFE, profile of a fraudster that will cause the most or the highest median loss is an owner or executive that has been there for more than 10 years, that has a university degree or higher, that is male, and that is between the ages of 31 to 50 years old. Now, the most prevalent fraudster or profile of an internal fraudster is an employee or manager that has been there for 10 years or more, that has a university degree, that is male, and that is between 31 to 50 years old. So I guess it's the same. The most fraudsters were employees or managers, but they typically cost between $50,000 and $125,000 in losses, whereas the lower amount, the next lower amount of owner and executive was 475,000 in median loss. But the rest is just the same. More than 10 years, educated with a university degree or higher, male, and between the ages of 31 to 50 years old. Now, this definitely does not mean that you need to be suspect of all, employees that fit that those categories, because, and going back to the all the Queen's horses, that example, first of all, it was a woman, so Rita Crudwell, so it wasn't a male. I don't know how old she was, but if it was for 20 years, at some point between the ages of 31 and 50, she was perpetrating fraud. So that was true. She did have a university degree. She had been there more than 10 years. And I don't know if you would consider her an owner, executive, or a manager. She was a finance director, but her losses, or the amount that she embezzled, was $50 million or $53 million, something like that. And so it was definitely at that level. So, yeah, she did kind of fit it, except she wasn't a male, she was a female. All right, so that's the profile of an internal fraudster. So now let's look at the behavioral red flags of fraud. And so I'm going to talk about the 8 most common behavioral red flags of fraud from this same infographic from ACFE. And what they say is that 75% of fraudsters displayed at least one of these 8. And so I'll talk about them in reverse order of the percentage of fraudsters that displayed that particular red flag. So there are 2 that tied at 9%. So number 8 is they displayed divorce or family problems. All right, so the next one up is number 6. That was at 11%. And this behavioral red flag was they had exhibited bullying or intimidation. And let me just say, that can be a cultural thing too within your company. I have definitely worked at companies where that was just kind of the attitude. Never thought about it as a behavioral red flag of fraud, but it could have been. The next one, number 5, is also at 11%, meaning 11% displayed these behavioral red flags, was irritability, suspiciousness, or defensiveness. And I guess that makes sense because they know that they are doing something wrong. And so, yes, they would be suspicious because that's what they're doing. And usually, what's that saying? It takes one to know one. So they're suspicious of other people because they know that they are perpetrating fraud. And then if they're asked anything that comes close to, discovering the fraud, yes, they might get defensive about that. All right. So number four was 12%, and this was control issues. So unwillingness to share duties. So these are the folks that if they take a vacation, they go out on vacation, but they don't let someone perform like all their duties. And this was something we definitely saw with Rita Cromwell in All the Queen's Horses because she had she had a person under her that did the bank reconciliations, but they didn't do all the bank reconciliations. So more to come on that. All right, the next one, number three, was 17%. And this one is that behavioral red flag is unusually close association with a vendor or a customer because they could be colluding with them, right, to perpetrate fraud. And so that is one flag, again, at 17%. And then with number two, we jump all the way up to 29%. So 29% of the internal fraudsters had this behavioral red flag, and that was financial difficulties. Now, let me just say that was definitely not Rita Cromwell because she had been embezzling for so long, she had no financial difficulty. So that definitely wasn't her. But you know what? The number one behavioral red flag at 39% definitely was her, and that was living beyond her means. But I will say, that it was hard to tell. She was even friends with or acquaintances or colleagues or whatever with the mayor. And the mayor knew, right? Everybody knew that she had horses. That's why it's called All the Queen Horses. She had these, expensive buses that would carry her and her horses around, right, to all these horse shows or whatever it is they were going to. And the mayor, I think they found they had tape of him in the documentary, just saying he thought it was family money. Because how would you necessarily know whether it was family money or whether it was because they were embezzling? But that is the number one behavioral red flag of fraud, and that is again living beyond their means. All right, so we talked about profile of a fraudster. We just talked about the 8 behavioral red flags, of which 75% of fraudsters displayed at least one of these. Now let's talk about the number one weakness that allowed the fraud to happen. And this should come as no surprise to you. And that is a lack of internal controls. And that percentage for the lack of internal controls was 33%. And the second highest at 19% was yes, you have internal controls, but you overrode them. So, override of existing internal controls was 19%. So, it's about internal controls. And I didn't mention this, but I do want to make sure I bring it up. The most effective anti fraud control at 50%, that resulted in 50% of lower losses and 50% of faster detection was surprise audits. So there you go. All right. So, lack of internal controls, and this was really how Rita Cromwell got away with her fraud as long as she did because there was a another separate bank account. So I talked about how the person underneath her, I think it was the assistant director. Anyway, that team member was the one that did the bank reconciliations, but that team member didn't know that there was an extra bank account that that Rita was using for this fraud. And so the way that she ended up getting caught is the number one way that employers find out, and that is employee tips. And so there was a new employee, and that employee contacted the bank to get all of the bank statements to do the reconciliation. And it just so happens that I think it was also a new employee at the bank. So when that new assistant finance director contacted that new employee at the bank, requested the bank statements, the employee at the bank did not know that she was not, or they were not supposed to give that extra bank account that nobody knew about. And so she gave her all of the bank statements. And then it was like, well, what's this bank statement? So that's how she got caught. And so um, that was I guess might have been three things. So, one, the lack of internal control because no one knew about about that separate bank account. So, how does she open it, right? And then the fact that no one else was doing the bank reconciliation because they didn't know about it. So that's two. And maybe even three with collusion because Rita would have had to collude with that bank employee to get her to not or to get that bank employee to not give her next level down the bank statement for the bank account that nobody knew about. So I don't remember if they identified that in the movie or not, but yeah, it could be up to, three things that allowed this fraud to go on for so long. So what the ACFE found was that on average, the presence of internal controls reduced fraud losses by more than one third. And anti fraud controls really contribute to reducing the potential for internal fraud. And so, with that in mind, I didn't talk about it before, but I do have a training session that is called Mitigating Segregation of Duties, Conflicts in the P2P Process. And so, if that's something that you think you or your team needs to learn more about, I put a link to that in the show notes where you can, take a look at the description and see if that's something that you or your team would like to enroll in. All right. So with that, I think that's all for today. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed the 389th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.